They are involved in gold mining, influencing political campaigns. And they've also, just like in Ukraine and also in Syria, they have been accused of committing atrocities against civilians. And it's also worth remembering that what they did in Ukraine, some of the most egregious actions included taking Ukrainian children away from their parents and then taking them to Russia, many of whom have not yet been discovered again. So you're looking at a group that is commercially orientated, but is also in the business of destroying people's lives.
Well, let's turn to Dr. Sajjan Gohel. He is chair of the NATO Counter-Terrorism Advisory Group and International Security Director at the Asia Pacific Foundation and host of the NATO podcast. Good evening to you, Dr. Gohel.
Good evening.
What do you make of this decision by the British government to proscribe the Wagner Group?
It's a very important decision, Carol, because if you look at the Wagner Group, this is a private Russian military company. It is also a Kremlin-backed mercenary group. From Syria to the Sahel to Ukraine, they have been accused of torturing, raping, and murdering civilians. This is a group that has caused chaos wherever they exist in the world. So it's a very important moment. And it will require a lot more action by other countries to follow suit, hopefully.
What do you think is going to be the effect of it? Major General Chip Chapman, I don't know if you're able to hear him, was wondering how much the actual practical effect would be on this organisation.
Well, the concern previously was that such a move in prescribing them could potentially jeopardize British outreach to a handful of countries in Africa that have had political instability, such as Mali, the Central African Republic, and that it could spiral into further chaos if the British government goes after Wagner too hard. But we've seen that it actually hasn't changed anything because there have been coups in Niger, which the Wagner Group has welcomed. Now, the other thing to think about when it comes to the Wagner Group is that there isn't actually a single entity known as the Wagner Group. Rather, it's more like a sprawling network of shell companies that have very shadowy operatives whose services range from all-out warfare to troll factories to disinformation. And what this designation could potentially do is free up British intelligence agencies and also the Crown Prosecution Service to actually devote more time and resources to trying to counter the Wagner's global networks. And I think that's very important.
And we've seen that the Labour Party's been calling for this to happen, as have some senior Conservatives, including the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Cairns. What do you think about the timing of this? Why has the government taken this step now?
One of the things to think about is what has taken place recently, which you were talking about with Major General Chip Chapman, which was the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was seen as the head of the Wagner Group. And along with him, mysteriously dying in a mid-air explosion were his two key lieutenants, Dmitry Utkin and Valery Cheklakov. Now, what's important to remember about the Wagner Group is that its ties to the Kremlin itself. You're potentially witnessing a hostile takeover by the Kremlin of the Wagner Group. It was nicknamed Putin's private army. The Wagner Group was used to boost Russian influence around the world. And Vladimir Putin very recently even acknowledged that it was being funded by the Russian state itself. So if you see Russia now swallowing up the Wagner Group, it is very important to take action because effectively it's an auxiliary arm of the Russian state that actually commits chaos and murder and destruction.
I mean, we've been hearing for quite some time about some of the violent, destructive acts that have been carried out by troops that are part of this organisation. And I mean, there was that extraordinary video, wasn't there, of Prigozhin effectively recruiting people from prisons across Russia. Given all of that, I mean, are there likely to be many people in the UK who would be supportive of this group? Or is this more about trying to seize some of the Wagner Group's assets?
Well, there are, as Major General Chip Chapman mentioned, people on various ideological persuasions that may see the Wagner Group in a different light. And that's very much down to disinformation operations that they and Moscow put out. Where I think there are areas that need to be looked at more are their murky commercial interests, especially what they're doing in Africa. They are involved in gold mining, influencing political campaigns. And they've also, just like in Ukraine and also in Syria, they have been accused of committing atrocities against civilians. And it's also worth remembering that what they did in Ukraine, some of the most egregious actions included taking Ukrainian children away from their parents and then taking them to Russia, many of whom have not yet been discovered again. So you're looking at a group that is commercially orientated, but is also in the business of destroying people's lives.
Given the complex relationship between Wagner and President Putin, what do you think the Russian reaction will be? Because, as you say, these Wagner forces were seen to be acting on behalf of the Russian state. But then, of course, there was that move by Prigozhin against President Putin.
Well, that was certainly something that shocked everybody because Prigozhin was at one time seen as a close friend and ally of Vladimir Putin, but they began to have a massive falling out with each other over supplies, over weaponry, and the fact that the Wagner Group were not necessarily getting the support that they had wanted by the Kremlin. Now, that problem in some ways has been resolved with Prigozhin's very mysterious death. So what may now transpire is that you will see Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin further asserting their control over the Wagner Group. It's interesting that the Russian Ministry of Defense actually tried to swallow them up earlier this summer when they announced that all these volunteer units and private military groups had to be required to sign a contract with the defense ministry. When Prigozhin was there, that was an obstacle. That no longer is the case anymore. So what you're looking at is that absorption taking place. And it is important that other countries also now support the British action as well, because if there's going to be any change in Ukraine for the positive, one of the things that has to be cauterized is the Wagner Group.
Yeah, I was going to ask you whether you think that there will be similar moves to prescribe this group by perhaps the United States or other NATO allies.
Well, the US seems to be moving in that direction, albeit somewhat slowly. There are divisions between the White House and the Congress over what is the right approach to it. Certainly, the UK taking the lead is important, but we also need to acknowledge some of the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, because they have been calling for the Wagner Group to be prescribed for a very long time. And in many ways, they experience the potential ramifications of it because they are on the front line with Russia. They have the land borders with Russia itself, and they are directly impacted by the consequences of the dark arts that the Kremlin unleashes. So certainly more countries are going to have to follow suit in this. And I would say that it is not too far off. Keep in mind that there is a G20 meeting happening in India next week. Vladimir Putin is not attending. There's a useful opportunity there to build a further alliance against what Russia has been doing in Ukraine.
Dr Sajjan Gohel, Chair of the NATO Counterterrorism Advisory Group, International Security Director at the Asia Pacific Foundation. Really good to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.